I'm doing a review of my 2007 Yamaha FZ1. It's a second generation FZ1. It was a fairly popular sport touring bike back in its day, and there seems to be some resurgence of interest in this bike recently. But it's kind of a classic Japanese inline 4-cylinder bike. Very upright seating, similar similar to other sport touring bikes in that era. I guess I'll start from the top to the bottom. So, there's a lot of things that are not stock on this bike, so I can only really talk about the options and how it feels with what's on here now. But the windscreen is not the stock windscreen. It's quite a bit taller. It's a V-Stream windscreen, I believe. I didn't buy it. Its previous owner did, so I'm not too familiar with it. But I did add this lip here on the top, which I had on my Multistrada, and that makes for a very calm pocket behind the windscreen. But I think the stock windscreen probably causes buffeting for taller riders. The side view mirrors offer excellent visibility, but the left one is somewhat loose on this one, and it's not because the bolts are loose, it's just worn out. I do have a replacement one I got to pop in this weekend. But the mirrors are nice and wide, provide good visibility. Other things on this bike that are not stock, like I said, going from the top to the bottom. These shorty levers are nice. You can do a 1 or 2 finger clutch actuation and single finger brake actuation. They're fully adjustable. These gel grips on here are they're kind of cheesy looking, really. I don't like the pattern on there. They're kind of cheesy, but they're comfortable enough. But I think the stock ones would have been fine. Some people complain about a vibration in FZ1s. This one doesn't have any. It's very, very smooth, and I think it has to do with power commander and fueling mods that were done to it. So yeah, that's another modification on this one. The stock FZ1 is known for having kind of a jumpy throttle response, on-off throttle response. This is somewhat jumpy on the stock bike. This one, due to the power commander, is very, very smooth fueling throughout. I do have a steering damper on here as well, which helps a lot. There's certain I ride with some sport bike riders and sport touring riders on the weekend, and there's a specific couple of curves that we take where on the Multistrada I get some head shake, and this bike is completely solid through those corners, bumpy corners, because of the steering damper in part. The bike doesn't have clip-ons, but the bars are still fairly narrow, I would say. Compared to like an adventure bike. So you can still squeeze through traffic pretty well. Like I can actually store this in my back sunroom and get through the doorway in the back, which I couldn't do on the Multistrada. So it's got a good practical narrow handlebar from that standpoint. The steering effort is a little bit high at low speeds compared to adventure bikes, but better than sports bikes. Other mods on this bike: an R1 rear shock, which makes for good stability when riding aggressively, but it is on rough roads. It is quite a bit jumpy. Or it is pretty harsh. Not as harsh as the sports bike, but harsher than the stock suspension. So I do feel I get bounced off the seat if I hit some potholes or rougher sections of road. So I lift myself up, find myself lifting myself up off the seat. The transmission on this bike is incredibly buttery smooth. It's like it's so smooth. You can do clutchless upshifts at any RPM pretty much, and they just pop right into place. One interesting thing about the engine though is that even though it's a large, powerful engine based on the R1 liter bike engine, it's pretty gutless at low RPMs actually. You have to get into the higher revs to really feel thrust, but when you do it's very fast. I mean, it's crazy fast. It's like this bike in its current state of tune probably has about 150 horsepower to the rear wheel, so maybe 180 at the crank. So it's fairly close to modern liter bikes as far as overall power. But that low torque at low RPMs actually helps with tractability in the city. If you're taking slow corners in first gear and you accidentally give a little bit of throttle more than you expected, it's not gonna launch you forward. So it actually makes for some fairly easy drivability in city type environments. Whereas on the Multistrada, because it has a lot of low end V-twin torque, I find I have to be in second gear for those speed corners to make it truly tractable. Or this one I can stay in first gear and it's pretty easy to control. Fuel economy is not the greatest. It's like upper 30s, lower 40s, and the fuel tank is not very big. So I find myself looking for gas stations shortly after 100 miles or so. You could probably do 120 pretty solidly. I mean, another issue is that the fuel light kind of comes on very early. You typically have more than a gallon left when the fuel light comes on. So it's kind of scares you into thinking you're running empty when you have quite a bit of fuel still in the tank. Now this bike doesn't have any modern electronics, no traction control, no ABS. So in some panic stop situations, I have found myself locking up both wheels, both tires. So you got to make sure you're upright if you're gonna brake hard. Traction, I've never felt like I've lost traction. Even kind of rolling aggressively coming out of turns. So it's the combination of suspension, Q3 Plus tires, and just a very tractable power delivery makes it fairly easy to not lose traction. Yeah, without ABS, I have locked up the both tires in different panic stop situations, avoiding a deer. So here's an example of how smooth the clutchless upshifting is. It's just like butter. So I do have Q3 Plus tires on here, which are great tires overall for sport touring and sport bikes on the street. The durability is not the greatest. Although this version is the Q3 Plus. I think it's the first set of Q3 Pluses. I used to run Q3s before, and the different compound in the middle of the rear seems to be helping with the durability of the rear tire. So that's good. I'll have to see when I end up replacing them. I do have a gear indicator installed on here, which is aftermarket. It's fairly useful, but it's not like an OEM rev indicator where this one, when you have the clutch pulled in and you shift, then you let it out. It takes a second or two sometimes to really indicate the proper gear. I guess it's doing some kind of detection with the revs or the speedometer and comparing it to tell you what gear you're in. But it's still nice to have. I do have a foam air filter on here as well, which is nice because you can wash it and should provide a little bit of better flow. LED front and rear indicators clean up the look of this bike in particular, because it has those the OEM turn signals are those dorky floppy you know, classic 90s Japanese bike turn signals. So it, you know, that cleans up the look, although you know, I think they're probably slightly less visible than the OEM turn signals. And then the rear ones in particular, they're narrower, closer to each other, so so you end up with you know, it's more difficult for cars behind you to tell if you're turning left or right when the turn signals are closer to each other. Braking power is really good. I mean, it's as strong as you need it to be, but still very easy to modulate. I really like the brakes on this bike. You know, similar bikes I've had in the past are VFR 800. You know, that's another sport touring bike. I've had a couple of VFR 800s. The suspension on this bike is quite a bit better than the VFR 800. Well, the VFR 800 was very you know, soft, so it was comfortable, but in more aggressive riding, you could get it to wallow a little bit. Tank protector, you know, pretty basic. So when you go to the R1 suspension in the back, you end up with a higher rear end. Also, it's got a 55 tire instead of a 50 profile tire. So the rear end sits a little bit higher, which makes for better steering in aggressive riding situations. You have a little bit more weight on the front. It's still very upright, but then, you know, that when you try to set the sag with the R1 shock, it seems like the spring is not really strong enough. You end up with no matter what you do, you end up with not enough or too much sag, it seems. But I really don't feel the rear bottoming out, so I'm leaving it as it is. And it could be that with R1 shock, you end up with more travel in the rear. So I mean, as long as I don't feel instability and it's comfortable enough, I'm gonna go ahead and leave it at a slightly higher sag than ideal. What else? I do have frame sliders on here, which is nice. I've taken this bike to the track once. And on the track, park here and we can look at the bike closer. On the track, I mean, the bike was fairly well mannered, but it is a pretty tight track that I took it to Arroyo Seco, so the bike feels kind of it does feel kind of big and heavy for that track. It weighs about 480 pounds, I think, stock weight, with the Yoshimura exhaust on here, which I haven't talked about. You know, it did lose some weight, and that exhaust sounds amazing. I mean, it feels like or it sounds like I'm on a MotoGP bike sometimes. You know, it's got a really nice sound to it. It is loud though overall. I always wear earplugs, so that it hasn't been an issue. I think this is aftermarket also, this underpan, which I really like the way that looks, because it's like a nice balance between a fully faired bike and a naked bike. I actually like how this little spoiler here or under chin fairing looks compared to it being completely naked. You know, this blacked out look of the engine is very clean, very nice. Everything's finished pretty well on the bike. Issues I've had. The other thing, it's got a really nice center stand. I mean, center stands are awesome in general. That makes maintenance so much easier. The only issue I've had with this bike is that, what is it? The cam position sensor, I think it's what it's called. There's a sensor on top of the engine here, and the wire that came off of that, maybe some of the mods somebody did previously, they ended up leaving that wire kind of loose. So it when I braked hard for a deer in the woods, that wire or a connector kind of moved forward, and the radiator fan ended up shredding it. So I couldn't get the bike started again, and kind of left me out in the woods. I had to hitch a ride into Silver City, New Mexico, get a U-Haul and a trailer, and go back up into the woods, track the bike down where I had left it, and trailer it back. But like I said, I think that's due to some aftermarket work somebody did, or they got in there and didn't leave that connector right. So I wouldn't blame that on Yamaha necessarily. Other than that, it's been rock solid, reliable. Yeah, I mean it's a nice looking bike overall. I mean this front end does look a little bit outdated, I would say. Kind of it looks like a classic '90s bike. Suspension is fully adjustable front and back. So I started with the stock settings, and then a few clicks more compression, rebound for slightly more sporty or aggressive riding. And I'm also kind of trying out a new this new GoPro knockoff camera. Seeing how the video looks there, I'm gonna actually turn it around for the ride back. Another comment on the bike's ergonomics. So I'm about a little bit over 5'11", and I'm used to my multistrada and taller adventure bikes that I've been riding recently, and I do have a comfort seat as an added seat, which raises it and gives me more leg room. But then I feel like I got extra weight on the bar, so I actually like the stock seat for shorter in city stuff. But my legs do feel kind of cramped. I mean, nothing compared to a sports bike, but I've gotten used to been spoiled by my multistrada with great leg room. But that's just something to note for taller riders potentially. If you're used to the larger adventure bikes, you're going to find this to be a little bit tight. So yeah, this CamPark what is this, the XC20 something like that camera. It's ridiculously cheap compared to a GoPro. Very similar specs, but I mean I'm sure the quality of the footage is not going to be the same as a GoPro. But for an action cam that I'm going to be using a lot on dirt bikes, I'm not going to buy a $400 GoPro and then have a crash and ruin it. Where I can try one of these Chinese cameras that are $40 to $80 and not have so much worry about dropping it or breaking it. But let's see what we'll see what the footage looks like. And it's supposedly a 4K camera, but I think it probably does some interpolation to get to 4K. It's really only native like 2 point something. But anyhow, I'm trying it out too. Hopefully my camera's still recording. I've been yapping non-stop. So yeah, that's the Yamaha FZ1, great all-around bike. But I do miss the safety net of modern electronics. I wish I had ABS in particular for panic stops. Traction control, if you're going through a turn in neutral throttle, you're going to be okay. It's just if you're trying to get really aggressive with the throttle on the way out, which I don't like to do on the streets anyway, that you could run into an issue. Out here in West Texas, the weather is great. So it rains very rarely, snows very rarely. So traction control and ABS are a little bit less critical, but I do wish I had ABS. I've had a couple of panic stop situations, some kids running out in the residential zone, a deer in the woods, where I did end up basically going to a full panic stop. It would have been nice to have ABS in those situations. We'll see what this camera angle ends up looking like. Love that exhaust for the most part. The gauges are nice. I really like a digital speedometer and an analog tach. I really like that combination. You know, I got time, coolant temperature, basic trip meters, but having a fuel gauge is nice. Having the aftermarket gear indicator on here is nice. You know, one thing about riding a lot of off-road recently, and I've been doing a lot more dirt biking and adventure biking, is that I've gotten used to using my rear brake more. So I do find myself locking up the rear brake sometimes on this bike because I'm in off-road mode. So you got to be careful with that and remember that on street you really should be using a lot more front brake. And then off-road, a lot of people forget that you still need to do a lot of front brake because that's where most of your braking power is, even off-road.